Rescue was never meant to come, until a human warship emerged from the void. The hull screamed before I did. A deep, tearing groan ran through the floor of my bridge, and sparks fell from the ceiling like burning rain. I grabbed the edge of my chair as the ship tilted, and I shouted for a damage report before I had even caught my breath. My name is Vextara, and at that moment, I was the last surviving officer in command of the Ostran, a cruiser of the Calresi Compact. We had been running from the Skarn hegemony for 6 days, hiding inside the twisted gravity fields of the Aldenar Drift, a graveyard of broken ships and dead stars. 6 days of silence, broken now by another explosion somewhere below Deck 3. Hull breach, sections 9 through 12, Doran called out from the engineering station, his voice tight with something close to panic. We are losing atmosphere. Backup shields are failing. I did not need him to tell me twice. I could feel it in the way the ship shuddered, in the way the lights flickered and dimmed, in the way my own hearts pounded harder than they should. The Ostran was dying, and I was the one who had to decide how many more of my crew would die with her. Seal sections 9 through 12, I ordered. Move everyone still alive in there to the forward compartments. Some of them will not make it in time, Doran said quietly. I did not answer him. There was nothing to say that would make it easier. I turned my attention to the main screen, where 3 Skarn warships hung in the darkness like predators circling something wounded. They had found us 2 hours ago, slipping through a gap in the drift that our sensors had failed to detect. Since then, they had been picking us apart, one strike at a time, patient and merciless, the way a hunter waits for tired prey to stop running. Status on our weapons, I said. Forward cannons are offline. We have partial power to the aft defense array, but it will not hold against another direct hit, came the reply from Yeslin, my weapons officer, a young Calresi who had never seen real combat before this week. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, though she tried to hide it. I looked around my bridge. 12 stations, only 7 still crewed. The others had gone silent one by one over the past 2 days, either wounded and moved to medical bay, or worse. I thought of Raylan, who had sat at the navigation console just yesterday, laughing about something his daughter had said before we left home. He was gone now, buried somewhere in the wreckage of Deck 4. Send another distress call, I said. Full spectrum, all channels. Commander, we have sent 11 distress calls already. Doran reminded me, not unkindly. Command headquarters marked our fleet as unrecoverable 3 days ago. No one is listening. Then we will make them listen, I said, though I did not believe my own words. I activated the comm system myself, my hand trembling slightly as I opened a channel that stretched out into empty space, hoping against reason that someone, somewhere, might hear it. This is Commander Vextara, of the Calresi cruiser Ostran, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. We are under attack in the Aldenar Drift. Our shields are failing, our weapons are nearly gone, and we have wounded crew who need immediate evacuation. If anyone receives this message, please respond. We do not have much time left. The channel hissed with static, the sound of nothing answering. I closed my eyes for a moment, just a moment, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. We were going to die out here, forgotten by the very government we had sworn to protect, in a corner of space so remote that our bodies might never be found. Commander, movement from the Skarn ships, Yeslin called out, her voice sharper now. They are repositioning. I think they are preparing for a final assault. I opened my eyes and looked at the screen. She was right. The 3 Skarn vessels had shifted formation, moving into a pattern I recognized from training simulations. A pattern designed to overwhelm a crippled target from multiple angles at once. There would be no surviving it. All hands, brace for impact, I said over the ship-wide comm, my voice carrying through every corridor that still had power. This is not a drill, I thought, in that moment, of my home on Calres Prime, of the quiet gardens near my family's dwelling, of the way the light fell through the leaves in the late afternoon. I thought of my mother, who had never wanted me to join the fleet, who had warned me that space was full of dangers no training could prepare a person for. I had not listened to her then. I wished, briefly and uselessly, that I had. Commander, Doran said suddenly, his voice different now, confused rather than afraid. I am reading something strange on long-range sensors. Define strange, I snapped, my patience worn thin by exhaustion and fear. There is a gravitational disturbance forming behind the Skarn ships. It does not match any known drive signature in our database. Not Skarn, not Compact, not anything from the neutral trade routes. I felt a cold prickle run down my spine, the kind that came from facing an unknown threat rather than a known one. Could it be another Skarn vessel? Something new? I do not think so, Doran said slowly, studying his console with a frown creasing his face. The energy readings are too clean, too controlled. Whatever this is, it is different from anything I have ever seen. On the main screen, the Skarn ships had noticed it too. Their formation broke apart, weapons swinging away from us and toward the disturbance instead, as though they recognized a threat greater than a crippled Calresi cruiser limping through the dark. I stood up from my chair, ignoring the pain in my side where a fallen support beam had struck me hours earlier, and walked closer to the screen, as if being nearer to it would somehow help me understand what I was looking at. The space behind the Skarn ships began to ripple, like the surface of still water disturbed by something rising from beneath it. Then, without warning, it tore open, and something enormous slid out of the darkness into the light of the nearest dying star. I had never seen a ship like it. It was long and angular, built from a metal that seemed to drink in the starlight rather than reflect it, its surface marked with lines of pale blue that pulsed faintly like something alive. It dwarfed the Skarn vessels, dwarfed my own crippled cruiser, dwarfed anything I had encountered in my years of service. "Identify that vessel," I ordered, though I already suspected that no one on my bridge would have an answer. "Running it through every database we have," Yeslin said, her fingers moving quickly across her console. A moment later, she looked up at me, and there was something in her expression I had not seen from her before, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "Commander, the design markers are matching something in our old archives, very old, pre-compact records from the early contact period." "Tell me," I said. "It is human," she said. "That is a human warship." For a moment, I could not speak. Of all the things I had expected to find at the edge of my own death, a human warship was not among them. Humans, as far as the compact was concerned, were a minor species, unpredictable and largely ignored, tucked away in their small corner of the galaxy, with little influence over matters that mattered to civilizations like mine. We did not expect help from them. We barely acknowledged their existence in official channels. And yet there it was, sliding silently into the space between us and the ships that meant to kill us, its hull glowing faintly in the darkness like something that did not belong to this part of the galaxy at all. "Commander," Doran said quietly, "what do we do?" I looked at the screen, at the massive vessel now hanging between my crew and the Skarn fleet, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in days. It was small, fragile, and almost foolish given everything we had already lost. It was hope. "We wait," I said, "and we watch." I did not know, in that moment, whether the ship had come to save us or simply to witness our end from a closer distance. I did not know if the stories about humans, the fragments of rumor and old records that made up most of what my people knew about them, held any truth at all. All I knew was that something had come out of the void when nothing was supposed to come, and for the first time since the Skarn had found us, I allowed myself to believe that the Ostran might not be the tomb I had already accepted it to be. The silence on my bridge stretched out, broken only by the soft hum of failing systems and the ragged breathing of my remaining crew. Every eye was fixed on the screen, on the strange, glowing shape that had appeared from nowhere to stand between us and death. Whatever happened next, I understood that I was about to witness something my people had never truly understood, and somewhere deep inside me, beneath the fear and the exhaustion, a question began to form that I would carry with me long after that day ended, whichever way it ended. Who were these humans, really? And why had one of their warships come all this way for people they owed nothing to at all? I need to explain something about myself before I continue this story, because without it, nothing that happened afterward will make sense. I was not raised to admire humans. I was not raised to fear them either, not exactly. I was raised to dismiss them, the way one dismisses a distant neighbor whose customs seem strange, and whose company is best avoided. I grew up on Calres Prime, the central world of the Compact, in a district built along terraced gardens that climbed the side of a mountain overlooking the capital city. My family had served the Compact for 4 generations, mostly in administrative roles, quiet and respected positions that valued patience over boldness. My mother worked in resource allocation, my father taught history at one of the regional academies. Neither of them had ever left our home system, and neither of them had ever wanted to. The Compact itself was old, older than most civilizations we had encountered in our long history of careful, measured expansion. We did not conquer, we did not rush. Our philosophy, taught to every child from the earliest age, was built around 3 principles: preserve what you have, expand only when it is safe to do so, and never risk the whole for the sake of the few. It sounds cold, written out like that, but it did not feel cold to us. It felt wise. It felt like survival. Humans did not fit into that philosophy at all, and that was precisely why my people struggled to understand them. I remember the first time I heard about humans in any real detail. I was young, sitting in my father's classroom because my own school had been closed for repairs after a storm, and he was teaching a lesson on minor species of the outer rim. He put up an image of Earth on the display screen, a blue and green world that looked, to my child's eyes, unremarkable in almost every way. They call themselves human, my father told his students, a young species, by our standards, barely out of their own solar system when we first detected their signals, aggressive, emotional, and prone to conflict among themselves before they even reached the stars. One of the other children raised a hand and asked why the compact had not simply brought them into the fold, the way we had with dozens of other developing species over the centuries. My father's answer stayed with me for the rest of my life. Because humans do not calculate risk the way we do, he said. They do not weigh the cost of an action against its benefit the way a rational species should. Our analysts have studied their history extensively, and the conclusion was unanimous. A species willing to risk everything for reasons that cannot be measured is a species too unpredictable to trust. I did not understand what that meant at the time. I only understood that humans were different, and that different, in the world I grew up in, was rarely a compliment. As I got older, I heard more stories, most of them second-hand, filtered through generations of compact caution. There were rumors of what some called the Human Wars, a period roughly 2 centuries ago when humanity had faced several hostile species simultaneously during their early expansion into the stars. The details were vague, deliberately so, because very few outside observers had ever gotten close enough to verify what actually happened. What was known, or at least believed, was that every species that had underestimated humanity during that period no longer existed as an independent power by the time the conflicts ended. The compact had taken note of this, quietly and carefully, the way we took note of everything that might one day matter. We did not offer humanity membership in our alliance networks. We did not extend the diplomatic courtesies we gave to other developing species. Instead, we watched from a distance, cataloged what we could observe, and mostly left them alone. It was easier that way, and safer, and safety was the thing my people valued above almost everything else. I joined the fleet against my mother's wishes when I was young enough to still believe that service meant something noble, something worth the risk. She had wanted me to follow my father into teaching, to live a quiet life within the safety of the capital, surrounded by gardens and old books and the comfortable certainty of a world that rarely changed. I wanted something different, though I could not have told you exactly what at the time. My early years in the fleet were unremarkable in the best possible way. I trained on patrol vessels along our established borders, learned the discipline of command under officers who had themselves come up through decades of careful, uneventful service. The compact's borders had been stable for generations, protected as much by diplomacy and mutual restraint as by any show of military strength. War, when it came at all, was rare and brief, settled quickly through negotiation before it could grow into something larger. That stability began to crack roughly 3 years before the day I found myself trapped in the Aldenar Drift. When the Skarn hegemony began expanding into territory the compact had long considered its own sphere of influence. The Skarn were not like the humans in the stories I had grown up hearing. They did not act out of some unpredictable emotional impulse that defied calculation. They were patient, methodical, and utterly without mercy, expanding their territory one small conflict at a time, always careful to avoid provoking a response large enough to threaten their overall strategy. They understood, better than anyone, how the compact thought, and they used that understanding against us at every turn. I remember the first briefing where our fleet command explained the Skarn threat in detail. A senior officer, a woman named Korvath who had served for over 3 decades, stood before a room full of younger officers like myself and laid out a simple, uncomfortable truth. The Skarn are counting on our caution, she said. They know we will not commit our full strength to defend every border world because the cost of doing so would outweigh the value of any single system. They are testing us, system by system, waiting to see exactly how much we are willing to lose before we finally respond with force. Someone in the room asked what would happen if the compact simply refused to give ground at all, if we committed everything necessary to stop the Skarn before they gained any further territory. Korvath's answer had stayed with me ever since, though I had not understood its full weight until much later. That is not how the compact operates, she said. We do not gamble everything on a single decision. We calculate, we adjust, and we accept losses when the alternative risk is too great. It has kept us alive for longer than most civilizations in this galaxy have existed. It will continue to keep us alive, even if the cost sometimes feels difficult to bear. I believed her then. I believed in the wisdom of caution, in the safety of measured decisions, in the idea that a civilization built on patience would always outlast one built on impulse. I believed it the way I believed the sky over Calres Prime would always be the same soft violet color it had been my entire life. I was assigned to the Ostran 2 years later, first as a junior officer and then, after the previous commander was reassigned to a diplomatic post, as her replacement. My crew came from all across compact space, young officers and experienced veterans alike, brought together to patrol the outer border regions where the Skarn had been steadily advancing. We knew the risks. We had all seen the reports of border worlds falling one by one, of Compact Command choosing, time after time, not to intervene directly, citing the same careful calculations that Korvath had described in that briefing years earlier. I did not question those decisions, not really. Not until I found myself on the receiving end of them. The mission that brought us to the Aldenar Drift had seemed simple enough at first. We were assigned to monitor Skarn movement along a contested border region, gathering intelligence that would help Fleet Command decide how to respond to their continued expansion. It was the kind of mission I had performed dozens of times before, quiet and largely uneventful, the sort of assignment that rewarded patience and caution above all else. What none of us knew, what our own intelligence had failed to detect, was that the Skarn had been planning something larger than a simple border skirmish. They had been massing ships along a hidden approach through the drift itself, using the gravitational anomalies to hide their numbers from compact sensors until it was too late for any of us to retreat safely. By the time we realized what was happening, we were already surrounded. I sent word back to Fleet Command immediately, requesting reinforcement, explaining in detail the scale of the threat we had discovered. The response came back within hours, and it was not what I had expected, though perhaps it should have been, given everything I had been taught to believe about how my civilization operated. Fleet Command determined that committing additional forces to the Aldenar Drift carried too great a risk relative to the strategic value of the region. My battle group was ordered to withdraw if possible, and if withdrawal was not possible, we were to hold our position and gather what intelligence we could before the situation became untenable. There was no promise of rescue in that order. There was no acknowledgement even that rescue might become necessary. We were simply expected to do our duty, to accept whatever outcome resulted from our efforts, and to understand that our lives, individually, mattered less than the broader calculation of compact survival. I remember reading that order alone in my quarters, the words blurring slightly on the screen as I tried to process what they truly meant. I thought of Korvath's briefing years earlier, of her calm insistence that caution and careful loss were the price of long-term survival. I had believed her then. I found, sitting alone with that order in front of me, that I no longer knew what I believed at all. 3 days later, the Skarn attacked in full force, and my battle group began to die. I am telling you all of this long history of caution and calculation and quiet acceptance of loss, because I want you to understand exactly what I believed about the universe before that human warship emerged from the void beside my crippled ship. I want you to understand why, when I first saw it, my instinct was not relief but confusion. A deep and unsettling confusion that came from watching something act in a way my entire life had taught me was impossible. Nothing in my training, nothing in my history, nothing in the careful, patient philosophy that had shaped every decision my civilization ever made, had prepared me for the sight of a ship risking itself for people it had never met, in a system that held no strategic value to anyone but the handful of us still breathing inside it. I did not know it yet, standing on my dying bridge with my crew watching that strange glowing vessel in silence, but everything I believed about caution, about calculation, about the wisdom of never risking too much for too little, was about to be tested in a way I could never have prepared for. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the strange cold comfort of Korvath's old lessons, a small and stubborn voice had already begun to wonder if everything I had been taught to believe was wrong. The days before the human ship arrived were the hardest of my life, and I do not say that lightly, having lived through the events that came after. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from watching people you are responsible for slowly running out of options, one system failure at a time, while you search for words of comfort you no longer believe yourself. Our battle group had entered the Aldenar Drift with 6 ships. By the time the Skarn sprang their trap, we were already down to 4. Having lost 2 vessels during the initial ambush before we even understood the scale of what we were facing. I remember the moment we lost the Kestrel, a smaller escort vessel commanded by an officer named Halvoran, a steady and dependable man who had served with me for nearly 2 years. His final transmission was brief, cut off halfway through a sentence, and then there was nothing but static where his voice had been. I did not have time to grieve properly. None of us did. Grief was a luxury that belonged to safer times, and we had entered a period where every decision, every order, had to be made with cold, immediate clarity, or more people would die in the space between hesitation and action. Over the following 2 days, the Skarn tightened their formation around what remained of our battle group, cutting off every possible route of escape through the drift's twisted gravitational currents. They did not rush the final attack. I understood now, looking back, that they did not need to. They had already won the moment they trapped us inside that dead zone of broken ships and dying stars. All that remained was the slow, patient work of finishing what they had started. I lost contact with the Meridian Star, one of our remaining cruisers, on the second day. Her commander, a quiet, thoughtful woman named Ashenvale, had been transmitting hourly status updates as a way for the 4 remaining ships to coordinate our defense. At the appointed hour, there was no update. I tried hailing her directly, then indirectly through backup channels, then finally sent a small message drone toward her last known position, hoping against reason that her communications array had simply failed rather than her entire ship. The drone returned 3 hours later with recorded sensor data instead of a response. The Meridian Star had been destroyed, her wreckage now scattered among the countless other broken hulls that filled the drift, indistinguishable from ships that had died decades or even centuries before ours. I remember standing on my bridge, watching that sensor data play out in silence, and feeling something inside me go very quiet and very cold. Ashenvale had a partner waiting for her back on Calrus Prime, and 2 children who would grow up without ever fully understanding what had happened to their mother out here in the dark, so far from anything that mattered to the wider compact. By the 3rd day, we were down to 2 ships, the Austran and a smaller support vessel called the Hailwind, commanded by a young officer barely out of training named Corin. I spoke with him often during those final days, partly out of necessity for coordinating our defense, and partly because I think we both needed someone to talk to who understood exactly what we were facing. "Do you think Command will send help?" he asked me during one of our last conversations, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying very hard to sound calmer than he felt. I did not want to lie to him, but I also did not have the heart to tell him the full truth, so I settled for something in between. "I do not know," I said. "We have sent every distress call we can manage. If help is coming, it will come. And if it is not coming?" I did not answer him directly. Instead, I told him to keep his shields at maximum efficiency, and to alert me immediately if his sensors picked up any change in the Skarn formation. It was a coward's answer, I know that now, but I did not have anything better to offer him at the time. Our supplies had begun running low well before the Skarn found us, a consequence of the extended patrol mission that had kept us in the drift far longer than originally planned. By the 3rd day of the siege, we were rationing food and water among the crew, and our medical stores had been almost entirely consumed treating the wounded from the initial ambush. I remember walking through the medical bay during a rare quiet moment, seeing rows of injured crew members lying in makeshift beds because our proper medical facilities had been damaged beyond use, and feeling a helplessness so complete it was almost physical. Ruth, our chief medical officer, met me near the entrance, her uniform stained and her eyes ringed with the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in days. I want to be clear that Ruth was Calresi, not human, despite sharing a name that would later become familiar to me through very different circumstances. She looked at me with an expression I had come to recognize over the past several days, the look of someone delivering news she did not want to give. "We are out of proper pain management for anything beyond minor injuries," she told me quietly, careful to keep her voice low enough that the patients nearby would not hear. "I have 6 crew members with serious wounds and nothing left to help them through the pain except what our basic emergency kits provide. Do what you can," I told her, because there was nothing else to say. She nodded, her expression grim, and returned to her work without another word. I sent our 12th distress call that evening, though by then I no longer expected any response. Fleet Command had gone silent 2 days earlier, after a final message informing us that the sector had been formally reclassified as a total loss and that no further resources would be committed to our recovery. I remember reading that message alone, sitting in the small privacy of my quarters, and understanding for the first time exactly how completely my civilization had already accepted our deaths. I want to explain something about that message, because I think it reveals something important about the Compact's way of thinking, something I had believed in my entire life, without ever fully understanding what it meant in practice. The message was not cruel in its language. It was almost gentle, filled with careful phrases about difficult decisions and the greater good of the Compact as a whole. It spoke of honoring our sacrifice through the intelligence data we had gathered about Skarn tactics, data that would supposedly help protect other border systems in the future. It did not once use the word abandon, though that was exactly what was happening. It did not once acknowledge that 4 ships full of living, breathing people were being written off as an acceptable cost in a calculation made by officials sitting safely in offices on Calres Prime, officials who would never have to look into the eyes of the people whose lives they had just decided were not worth saving. I called a meeting with my senior officers that night, gathering Doran, Yeslin, Ruth, and 2 others in the small conference room adjacent to my quarters, one of the few spaces on the ship still fully functional. I told them what the message had said, watching their faces carefully as the reality settled over each of them in turn. "So that is it," Yeslin said finally, her voice flat with something between anger and disbelief. "After everything, they are simply leaving us here. They believe committing additional forces would risk more than it would save," I said, repeating the careful language of the message, even though I no longer believed in it myself. "And what do you believe, Commander?" Doran asked me directly, his eyes meeting mine with a kind of quiet challenge I had not expected from him. I did not have a good answer for him. I told them what I had always been taught, that the Compact's caution had kept us alive for centuries, that individual losses, however painful, served a larger purpose in preserving the whole. I heard the words coming out of my own mouth, and for the first time in my life, I did not believe them even as I spoke them. Ruth was the one who finally broke the silence that followed. "I do not care about the larger purpose right now," she said quietly. "I care about the 6 people in my medical bay who are in pain, and the rest of this crew who deserve better than being treated as an acceptable loss in someone else's calculation." No one argued with her. I think, in that moment, we all felt the same thing, though none of us had the courage to name it directly. We had been raised to believe in a system that valued careful, patient survival above all else, a system that had kept our civilization safe and stable for generations. And now, faced with the reality of what that system actually meant when applied to our own lives, we found ourselves questioning everything we thought we understood. I spent the following hours preparing my crew for what I believed, at the time, was our inevitable end. I ordered Doran to begin compiling our sensor data on Skarn tactics into a format that could survive even if our ship did not, hoping that some future rescue or recovery mission might eventually find it and make use of what we had learned. I ordered Yeslin to conserve what remained of our weapons power, focusing entirely on defense rather than any hope of offense against a numerically superior enemy. I visited every section of the ship that still had breathable atmosphere, speaking with whatever crew members I found there, trying to offer what comfort I could without lying to them about our chances. Most of them had already accepted the same grim reality I had. A few asked me directly if we were going to die, and I found myself unable to offer the false reassurance that might have been kinder in the moment. I told them the truth, that our situation was dire, that help seemed unlikely, but that we would continue fighting for as long as we were able, because giving up was the only outcome that guaranteed our failure. I thought often during those final hours about capture rather than destruction. The Skarn were known, in the limited intelligence we had gathered over the years, to take prisoners in certain circumstances, particularly when those prisoners might provide useful information or leverage in future negotiations. I did not know which outcome I feared more, a quick end in the destruction of my ship, or a slower, more uncertain fate at the hands of an enemy who had shown us no mercy throughout this entire encounter. I remember standing alone on my bridge in the quiet hour before the Skarn began their final assault, looking out at the debris field surrounding us, at the countless wrecks of ships that had died in this same dark corner of space, long before we ever arrived. I wondered how many of those ships had also been abandoned by whatever civilization had once claimed them, left to drift and die in the Aldenar Drift because someone, somewhere, had decided their survival was not worth the cost of saving them. It was into that silence, that particular quality of despair that comes from being both surrounded by enemies and abandoned by your own people, that the first strange readings appeared on Doran's sensor console, readings that would soon become the massive human warship sliding out of the void beside us. But before I tell you about that moment again, I want you to understand fully what came before it, the complete weight of hopelessness that had settled over my crew and myself in those final days. We had exhausted every option available to us. We had accepted, as fully as anyone can accept such a thing, that our deaths were both likely and, according to the careful calculations of our own government, ultimately acceptable in the larger scheme of compact survival. I had given up, in the private honesty of my own thoughts, on any possibility of rescue. I had begun instead to focus only on how to make our final hours count for something, on how to protect as many of my remaining crew as possible for as long as I could manage, and on how to face whatever end awaited us, with whatever dignity remained available to a commander whose government had already written her off as an acceptable loss. That was the state of mind I carried onto my bridge in the final hour before everything changed, before the impossible readings appeared on our sensors, before the ship that should not have existed emerged from the darkness to stand between my dying crew and the enemy that meant to finish us. I carried with me every lesson the compact had ever taught me about caution and calculated sacrifice, and I carried, too, a growing and unfamiliar anger at a system that had asked so much of its people while offering so little in return when the cost of loyalty finally came due. I did not know, standing there in that quiet, desperate moment, that everything I believed about my own civilization and about the strange, distant species we called humans was about to be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The strange readings did not disappear the way I half expected them to. Sensor ghosts were common in the Aldenar Drift, artifacts of the region's twisted gravity fields playing tricks on our instruments, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to hope that this was simply another false alarm in a week that had already given us far too many. But Doran's voice, when he spoke again, carried none of the uncertainty that usually accompanied a sensor glitch. "Commander, it is solidifying," he said. "Whatever this is, it is not an anomaly in our instruments. Something is physically arriving in this system." I moved back to my chair and gripped the edge of the console in front of me, watching the main screen as the rippling distortion behind the Skarn formation grew more defined. The 3 enemy warships had already noticed it themselves, their weapons swinging away from our crippled cruiser and toward the new arrival, their formation shifting into a defensive posture I recognized from countless training simulations. Whatever was coming, the Skarn considered it a serious enough threat to abandon their assault on us, even if only for a moment. "Yeslin, status on our own systems," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage despite the tightness building in my chest. "Shields at 11%, weapons still mostly offline," she reported. "If that thing out there decides to attack everyone in this system indiscriminately, we will not survive long enough to find out what it wants." It was a fair concern, and one I shared, though I did not say so aloud. We had no way of knowing whether this new arrival represented an ally, an enemy, or simply another predator drawn to the wreckage and desperation that filled the drift. Space held stranger things than either the Compact or the Skarn, scavenger fleets and independent raiders who preyed on exactly this kind of vulnerable, isolated conflict. The rippling distortion tore open fully then, and the vessel slid out of it into the dim light of the dying star nearby. I had already described, in the earliest moments of encountering it, the shock of its size and its strange, glowing architecture. What I want to focus on now is what happened in the moments immediately after its arrival, because those moments taught me as much about the nature of this unknown power as the ship's appearance itself. It did not immediately attack. It did not immediately retreat. It simply hung there in the darkness, vast and silent, its weapons arrays clearly visible along its hull but not yet oriented toward any target. There was something deliberate in that stillness, something that felt less like hesitation and more like calculation, as though whoever commanded that vessel was taking a moment to fully assess the situation before committing to any course of action. "Commander, the Skarn are hailing the unknown vessel," Doran reported, his fingers moving quickly across his console. "I am picking up the transmission on a shared frequency. Do you want me to route it through our system?" "Do it," I said immediately. The transmission that came through was in the harsh, clipped dialect the Skarn used for formal military communication, a language I had learned enough of during my service to follow the general meaning, if not every precise word. The voice belonged to what I assumed was the commander of the Skarn formation, and it carried the particular tone of a predator who had just discovered an unexpected obstacle between itself and its prey. "Unidentified vessel, you have entered contested Skarn territory," the voice said. "State your designation and purpose immediately, or you will be treated as a hostile combatant." There was a pause, long enough that I began to wonder if the human ship had even received the transmission, or if it possessed the capability to translate Skarn dialect at all. Then, to my surprise, a response came through on the same frequency, and I felt every member of my bridge crew go still around me as we listened. The voice that answered was calm, in a way that struck me as almost strange given the circumstances, measured and unhurried, without any of the aggression or fear I might have expected from a vessel that had just arrived in the middle of an active conflict. It spoke in accented but clearly understandable Skarn, which told me immediately that whoever commanded this ship had access to translation capabilities sophisticated enough to communicate fluently in a language their species had almost no documented contact with. "This is Captain Daniel Hale of the human vessel Halcyon," the voice said. "I am responding to a distress call from a Calresi cruiser in this system. I have no interest in your territorial claims. Withdraw your ships and allow the wounded vessel safe passage, and there will be no need for further conflict between us." I stared at the screen, and I could feel the disbelief radiating from every officer still standing on my bridge. A single ship, however large, was calmly demanding that 3 armed Skarn warships withdraw from a battle they were clearly winning, as though the outcome of such a demand was already settled in his favor. Did he just threaten them? Yeslin said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. I do not think that was a threat, Doran said slowly. I think that was simply a statement of fact, as far as he is concerned. The Skarn commander's response came quickly, and the anger in his voice was unmistakable, even through the imperfect translation running through our own systems. You have no standing here, human. This is Skarn territory, secured through conflict your species has no part in. Withdraw immediately, or you will share the fate of the vessel you came to save. I held my breath, waiting to see how the human captain would respond to what was, by any measure I understood, a direct and serious threat from a numerically superior force. If he backed down now, if he chose caution over confrontation, I understood that our fate would be sealed within minutes. The Skarn would resume their assault on us with renewed confidence, having successfully driven off the unexpected newcomer, and my crew's brief flicker of hope would collapse back into the same despair we had been living with for days. The response when it came was even shorter than his first. No, Captain Hale said simply. I do not think I will. There was something in the plainness of that answer that unsettled me more than any elaborate threat could have. It was not defiance delivered with anger or bravado. It was simply a statement, calm and unwavering, from someone who did not appear to feel the need to justify or explain his decision any further. The Skarn formation shifted again, their weapons arrays now rotating fully toward the human vessel, and I understood that we were about to witness whether this newcomer's confidence was justified, or whether it would prove to be the final, fatal mistake of an outsider who did not understand the true danger of the enemy he had chosen to confront. Commander, should we attempt to hail the human vessel ourselves? Doran asked, glancing at me for direction. I hesitated, weighing the risk of drawing further attention to our already crippled ship against the possibility of establishing some kind of communication with a potential ally. In the end, the choice felt less like a calculation and more like an instinct I could not fully explain, even to myself. Open a channel, I said, Calresi standard frequency, with a translation protocol attached in case they need it. Doran nodded and worked quickly at his console. A moment later, he gave me a signal that the channel was open, and I leaned forward, aware of every eye on my bridge watching me, aware that whatever I said next might be among the last words I ever spoke if the situation continued to deteriorate. Captain Hale, this is Commander Vexthera of the Calresi cruiser Ostran, I said, doing my best to keep my voice steady despite the uncertainty churning inside me. I do not know why you have come, but I want to thank you regardless of what happens next. My crew and I did not expect anyone to answer our call. There was a brief pause before his response came through, and when it did, I noted a subtle shift in his tone, something warmer and less formal than the exchange he had just had with the Skarn commander. Commander Vexthera, I received your distress signal about 6 hours ago, he said. I apologize for the delay in reaching you. The drift's gravitational currents made a direct approach difficult to calculate safely. I intend to get your crew out of this system, but I would appreciate it if you kept your remaining shields raised and your crew braced for the next few minutes. This may get difficult before it gets easier. I wanted to ask him a dozen questions in that moment. I wanted to know why he had come at all, what his ship was truly capable of, whether he understood the scale of the enemy force arrayed against him. But before I could form any of those questions into words, the Skarn commander's voice cut back across the shared frequency, sharp and final. You have made your choice, human, the voice said. Do not expect mercy for it. The 3 Skarn warships surged forward in unison, weapons charging visibly along their hulls, and I understood that whatever calm, calculated negotiation had briefly held this confrontation in balance was about to give way entirely to open conflict. All hands brace, I said over my own ship's comm, though I knew there was little more we could do to prepare ourselves beyond what we had already managed. Our shields were barely holding, our weapons were mostly useless, and our fate now rested almost entirely on the outcome of whatever was about to unfold between the Skarn fleet and the single, impossibly confident human vessel that had appeared to challenge them. I watched the screen in front of me, my hands clenched tightly at my sides, and I found myself hoping, with an intensity that surprised me, that this strange captain's confidence was not misplaced. I did not know him. I did not fully understand why he had risked his ship for people he had never met, in a system that offered him nothing in the way of strategic advantage. But in that moment, watching the Skarn fleet surge toward him with weapons blazing to life, I found myself desperately wanting him to survive what was about to happen, not only for my own crew's sake, but because some part of me had already begun to sense that this encounter was about to teach me something I had never truly understood about the universe beyond my own civilization's careful, cautious borders. The first shots fired a heartbeat later, and everything I thought I knew about warfare, about strength, about the true nature of the species my people had spent generations quietly dismissing, was about to be rewritten in front of my eyes. I have tried, many times since that day, to describe what I witnessed when the Skarn fleet charged the human vessel, and I have never quite managed to capture it fully in words. Every account I give feels smaller than the reality, the way a description of a storm can never quite convey the feeling of standing inside one. The 3 Skarn warships moved in a coordinated pincer formation, a tactic I recognized from years of studying their engagement patterns, designed to force an enemy to divide their attention and their defensive systems across multiple angles at once. It was an effective strategy against most opponents, one that had worked for the Skarn countless times as they expanded through compact border territory. I watched it unfold with a kind of detached horror, certain that I was about to witness the destruction of the only thing standing between my crew and total annihilation. The human vessel did not divide its attention at all. Instead, it moved with a fluid, almost unsettling precision, rotating along an axis that brought its heaviest weapon systems to bear on the lead Skarn ship before the pincer formation had even fully closed around it. I did not understand in that first instant what I was seeing. It looked less like a defensive maneuver and more like the vessel had simply anticipated the exact pattern of the attack before it began, adjusting its position with a confidence that suggested foreknowledge rather than reaction. "Commander, their weapons output," Yeslin said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have never seen readings like this. Whatever that ship just fired, our sensors are struggling to even classify it." The lead Skarn vessel's shields flared bright white under the impact, a brilliant, blinding light that filled my view screen for a fraction of a second before fading to reveal the ship still intact, though visibly staggering in its trajectory, systems flickering across its hull like a body absorbing a blow it had not expected to survive. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters for understanding everything that followed. The human ship did not destroy that vessel in its opening exchange. It could have, I would learn much later, quite easily. Instead, it delivered a strike calculated with what I can only describe as deliberate restraint, powerful enough to cripple the Skarn ship's offensive capability without committing to its total destruction. At the time, I did not understand the significance of that choice. I only understood that a single strike had accomplished more damage to a Skarn warship than our own crippled cruiser had managed to inflict during 6 days of desperate running combat. The remaining 2 Skarn vessels adjusted their approach immediately, clearly recalculating their strategy in response to what they had just witnessed. They split apart, attempting to flank the human ship from opposite directions, weapons firing in rapid succession as they closed the distance. I watched streams of energy fire crossing the space between them and the Halcyon, watched the human vessel's shields absorb impact after impact, with only minor fluctuations in the readings Yeslin called out to me. "Their shields are barely being affected," she said, disbelief evident in every word. "Whatever that technology is, it is generations beyond anything we have ever encountered." The human ship responded to the flanking maneuver with a second strike, this one directed at the vessel approaching from what would have been its more vulnerable angle. Again, the strike was precise, calculated, and devastating without being final. The second Skarn ship's engines flared and died, leaving it drifting, disabled but not destroyed, tumbling slowly away from the confrontation. The remaining Skarn commander, the one whose voice I had heard issuing threats across the shared frequency only minutes earlier, seemed to understand at that point that the calculation had changed entirely. His voice came through again, no longer carrying the confident aggression it had held before, but something closer to disbelief mixed with barely contained fear. "This is not possible," he said, more to himself than to anyone listening. "No single vessel should carry this capability." The human captain's response, when it came, was almost gentle in its delivery, which somehow made it more unsettling than any triumphant declaration could have been. "I would suggest reconsidering your position," Captain Hale said. "I have no wish to destroy your remaining ships. I only wish to ensure that the Calresi vessel behind you and its crew are allowed to leave this system unharmed. That outcome is still available to you, if you choose it." There was a long pause on the shared frequency, long enough that I found myself holding my breath again, uncertain which way the encounter would ultimately resolve. I watched the third and final Skarn ship, still undamaged, hanging at a distance from the human vessel, its weapons still charged but no longer actively firing. "You would let us withdraw," the Skarn commander said finally, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that I understood completely, given everything I knew about how conflicts in this region typically ended. I have no interest in destroying ships that are retreating, Captain Hale replied. My priority is the safety of the crew I came here to help, not the total defeat of your forces. Make your choice quickly. I do not intend to wait long. I do not know what calculations passed through the Skarn commander's mind in the moments that followed, whether he weighed the loss of 2 disabled ships against the potential destruction of his final vessel, or whether some deeper instinct simply told him that continuing this fight was no longer a battle he could win. Whatever the reasoning, his response came a few moments later, terse and clipped, the sound of a predator forced into an unfamiliar and unwelcome position of retreat. We are withdrawing, he said. This is not finished, human. You have made an enemy today that you do not yet understand. Perhaps, Captain Hale replied, his tone unchanged, still calm and measured despite the weight of the threat. I have found that most enemies eventually understand each other eventually, one way or another. I watched on my screen as the undamaged Skarn vessel began pulling back, its 2 disabled companions drifting slowly in its wake, gathered up and towed away into the depths of the drift by systems I could not fully identify from this distance. Within minutes, all 3 ships had retreated beyond the range of our sensors, leaving behind only the drifting wreckage that had already accumulated in this graveyard system, and the massive, glowing shape of the human vessel that had somehow, impossibly, driven them away. The silence that followed was almost as disorienting as the battle itself had been. My bridge crew stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the screen, at the empty space where our enemies had been only minutes before, as though none of us could quite believe what we had just witnessed. Commander, Doran said finally, his voice hoarse, are we alive? It was a strange question, given that we were obviously still breathing, still standing on the deck of our ship, but I understood exactly what he meant by it. We had spent 6 days certain that death was approaching, certain in the particular way that comes from watching every possible avenue of hope close one after another. And now, in the span of a few impossible minutes, that certainty had been shattered entirely, replaced by something we had almost forgotten how to feel. We are alive, I confirmed, my own voice unsteady in a way I did not try to hide. The channel crackled again, and Captain Hale's voice returned, calmer now that the immediate threat had passed, though there was an underlying urgency in his tone that reminded me our situation, while improved, was far from resolved. Commander Vexthara, your ship's condition looks serious from what I can read on my sensors, he said. I am prepared to send transport shuttles to begin evacuating your crew, starting with anyone who is critically wounded. Can your ship maintain life support long enough for a full evacuation? I glanced at Doran, who checked his readings quickly before giving me a small, uncertain nod. Perhaps 2 hours, Commander. If we shut down all non-essential systems, he said. 2 hours should be more than sufficient, I told Captain Hale. We have 6 crew members in critical condition, and roughly 40 more who are able to move under their own power, though several are injured to varying degrees. Understood, he replied. I am dispatching shuttles now. Please have your medical staff prepare a priority list for evacuation order. My own medical team will be ready to receive your wounded the moment they arrive aboard. I gave the necessary orders, watching my crew move with a renewed energy that had been entirely absent only an hour earlier. The particular energy that comes from suddenly rediscovering hope after having fully abandoned it. Ruth hurried toward the medical bay to begin organizing our critical patients for transport, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the urgency of the moment. Yeslin and Doran began the careful work of shutting down non-essential systems throughout the ship, preserving what little power remained for the life support functions we would need to survive the coming hours. I remained on the bridge, watching the main screen as small transport shuttles began emerging from docking bays along the human vessel's hull, their approach smooth and controlled despite the residual gravitational disturbances still lingering from the earlier battle. I had never seen shuttlecraft of that design before, sleek and efficient in a way that seemed to reflect the same quiet confidence I had heard in Captain Hale's voice throughout the entire encounter. As I watched the first shuttle approach our damaged airlock, I found myself thinking again about everything I had been taught throughout my life about humans, about their supposed recklessness, their unpredictable nature, the careful distance my own civilization had always maintained from a species we considered too dangerous and too different to fully trust. None of what I had just witnessed matched those old assumptions. I had seen restraint where I expected aggression. I had seen calculated mercy where I expected only violence. I had seen a single ship risk everything for people it owed nothing to at all, and then choose, when victory was fully within its grasp, not to pursue total destruction of an enemy that had shown my own people no such mercy. I did not yet understand what any of that truly meant, not fully, not in the way I would come to understand it over the following days. But standing on the ruined bridge of my dying ship, watching the first human shuttle dock against our hull, I understood that something fundamental in my own worldview had already begun to shift, and that I would never again be able to think about humans, or about my own civilization's careful, cautious philosophy, in quite the same way I had before. The airlock hissed open, and I turned to see the first members of the human rescue team stepping through, their movements efficient and calm despite the chaos and damage surrounding them. I straightened my posture as best I could, wiped away what evidence of exhaustion and fear I was able to hide, and prepared to meet, for the first time in person, the species my people had spent generations quietly dismissing as too unpredictable to matter. I had no idea, in that moment, just how wrong that old assumption truly was. The man who stepped through my airlock did not look like what I had expected, though I am not sure what exactly I had expected in the first place. He was tall, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and he wore a simple gray uniform without the elaborate markings of rank and honor that decorated compact officer attire. What struck me most was his expression, calm and attentive, without any of the arrogance I might have assumed would accompany someone who had just single-handedly driven off 3 warships. "Commander Vexthara," he said, extending a hand toward me in a gesture I recognized from old records of human customs, though I had never actually witnessed it performed in person. "Daniel Hale, I am glad we reached you in time." I hesitated only briefly before accepting the gesture, gripping his hand the way I had seen described in outdated cultural files that our archives kept largely for historical curiosity rather than practical use. "Captain Hale," I said, "I do not have adequate words to express my gratitude for what you have done here today." "You do not need to thank me," he said simply. "Anyone who could have answered that call should have. I am only sorry it took as long as it did to reach you." There was something in the plainness of that statement that unsettled me nearly as much as the battle itself had. He spoke as though answering a stranger's distress call across hostile, unclaimed territory was an obvious and unremarkable act, rather than the extraordinary risk it had clearly been. I found myself studying his face, searching for some sign of the calculation I would have expected from a compact officer in his position, some evidence of a cost-benefit analysis being run behind his eyes even as he spoke with such casual generosity. I did not find it. Whatever reasoning had brought him here, it did not appear to involve the kind of careful weighing of strategic value that had shaped every decision my own government had made regarding my crew's fate. Behind him, his rescue team moved through my ship with quiet efficiency, working alongside my own crew to help the wounded toward the waiting shuttles. I watched one of his medical officers, a woman with short reddish hair who introduced herself simply as Grace, kneel beside one of my injured crew members and begin assessing his condition with a gentleness that seemed entirely genuine, rather than performed for my benefit. "Your medical officer," I said, nodding toward her. "She treats my crew as though they were her own." Captain Hale glanced over at Grace and gave a small, understanding smile. "That is generally how we try to operate," he said. "Once someone needs help, their species stops being the relevant detail." I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, watching instead as the evacuation continued around us. I thought of the careful calculations my own government had made regarding our lives, the language of acceptable losses and strategic value that had filled every message from Fleet Command over the past several days. I could not imagine any compact officer speaking the way Captain Hale had just spoken, with such simple, unadorned conviction that helping people in danger required no further justification beyond the fact that they were in danger. "May I ask you something, Captain?" I said finally, unable to fully suppress the question that had been building inside me since his ship first emerged from the void. "Of course. Why did you come?" "Truly, my own government abandoned this rescue as an unacceptable risk. We are not your allies. We are not even, as far as I understand, on particularly friendly terms with your species. What could possibly justify the risk you took today?" He considered the question for a long moment before answering, and I got the sense that he was choosing his words carefully, not out of caution regarding what he could safely reveal, but out of a genuine desire to explain something that mattered to him. "I received a distress call," he said simply. "A ship in danger, wounded crew, no one else responding. That was enough of a reason for me." "That seems like an extraordinarily simple answer for an extraordinarily complicated risk," I said. "Perhaps," he replied, "but I have found that the simplest reasons are often the truest ones. We complicate things when we start trying to calculate exactly how much a life is worth relative to the resources required to save it. I have never found that kind of calculation particularly useful." I thought again of Korvath's old briefing, of her calm insistence that the compact could not afford to gamble everything on every decision, that careful loss was simply the price of long-term survival. I thought of the message from Fleet Command, gentle in its language but devastating in its meaning, informing us that our lives had been weighed against strategic value and found wanting. I did not know how to reconcile everything I had been taught with the plain, uncomplicated conviction I was hearing from this man standing in the wreckage of my own ship. My people would call that reasoning reckless, I said, though I found I could not put the same conviction into the word that I once would have. Captain Hale did not seem offended by the observation. Instead, he offered a small, knowing smile, as though he had heard some version of this exact criticism many times before. "We have been called worse things by better allies than your compact," he said, though there was no real bitterness in his tone, only a kind of tired familiarity. "I understand the reputation. Unpredictable, emotional, willing to risk too much for reasons that cannot be properly measured. I have heard it all before, from species far more experienced in dealing with us than yours." "Is it true?" I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. "The reputation, I mean. Is there truth to it?" He considered this for a moment, glancing around at the ongoing evacuation before answering. "I think every reputation contains some truth and some exaggeration," he said. "We do value things your compact might consider inefficient. Loyalty, individual life, the idea that some choices matter regardless of their cost. Whether that makes us reckless or simply different, I suppose depends on which side of a rescue you happen to be standing on." Before I could respond further, Doran's voice broke urgently across the ship's comm system, cutting through whatever quiet understanding had been building between myself and the human captain. "Commander, long-range sensors are picking up a significant Skarn fleet formation entering the system," he said, his voice tight with renewed alarm. "This is not the same 3 ships from before. I am reading at least 12 vessels, moving fast, and they do not appear to be slowing down." I felt the brief warmth of hope that had been building inside me since the earlier battle curdle immediately into fresh dread. 12 ships was a force far beyond anything a single vessel, however impressive, could reasonably be expected to withstand. I turned to Captain Hale, searching his expression for some sign of the same alarm I felt building in my own chest. What I found instead was a calm, focused attentiveness, the look of a man recalculating a plan rather than abandoning one. "How much time do we have?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharper, more urgent, though still carrying none of the panic I might have expected given the scale of the threat approaching. "Based on their current trajectory and speed, perhaps 15 minutes before they reach effective weapons range," Doran replied. Captain Hale turned back to me, and for the first time since our meeting, I saw something new in his expression, a seriousness that suggested he understood exactly how dangerous the situation had just become, even as he showed no sign of retreating from it. "Commander, I need your remaining crew moved to my ship as quickly as possible," he said. "I am not going to be able to protect 2 vessels simultaneously if that fleet decides to press a serious attack." "What about the Austran?" I asked, thinking of the ship that had carried my crew through 6 days of desperate survival, the vessel that had become, in its own broken way, the last piece of home any of us had left in this remote and hostile corner of space. "I am sorry, Commander," he said, and I believed the sincerity in his voice completely. "But your ship cannot survive what is coming. Get your people to safety. That is what matters now." I nodded, understanding the truth of what he was saying, even as some part of me mourned the loss of everything the Austran represented. I gave the necessary orders, my voice steady despite the fear building inside me at the thought of 12 Skarn warships bearing down on a single human vessel, however impressive its capabilities had proven to be in that earlier smaller engagement. As my crew hurried toward the waiting shuttles, and as Captain Hale moved quickly back toward his own vessel to prepare for what was clearly about to become a far more serious confrontation than the one we had already survived, I found myself wondering, with a mixture of hope and genuine fear, whether the confidence I had witnessed in this man and his extraordinary ship would prove sufficient against a force 12 times larger than the one it had already defeated. I did not know the answer. I only knew that I was about to find out, and that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not only my own survival, but the survival of every crew member I had left, all of us now entirely dependent on the judgment and capability of a species my own government had spent generations quietly, carefully, and I was beginning to realize, quite foolishly underestimating. I watched the final stages of my crew's evacuation from a small observation window near the airlock, my hands pressed against the cold metal frame as the last shuttle prepared to detach from the Austran's hull. Behind me, the ship groaned softly, as though it understood, in whatever way a vessel could understand such things, that its long service was coming to an end. I was among the last to leave, staying behind with Doran and a small skeleton crew to ensure the evacuation proceeded without incident. As our shuttle finally pulled away from the ship that had carried us through 6 days of desperate survival, I allowed myself one final look back at the Austran, drifting silent and broken in the debris field, and felt a complicated grief settle over me that I did not have time to fully process before more urgent matters demanded my attention. The interior of the human shuttle was compact but efficient, filled with the quiet hum of unfamiliar systems and the low murmur of voices speaking a language I understood only partially through the translation devices Captain Hale's crew had quickly provided us. I sat beside Doran, watching through a small viewport as the massive shape of the Halcyon grew larger ahead of us, and behind it, terrifyingly, the growing formation of Skarn warships closing in from the far side of the system. We docked aboard the human vessel with only minutes to spare, before the Skarn fleet entered effective weapons range. I was escorted quickly through unfamiliar corridors toward what I was told was an observation deck, a space with reinforced viewports that would allow me to witness the coming confrontation, while remaining safely removed from the ship's primary combat systems. Doran and the rest of my surviving crew were led toward medical and quartering areas deeper within the vessel, leaving me largely alone with my thoughts as the Halcyon began preparing for what was about to become a battle unlike anything I had witnessed in my entire career. Grace, the medical officer I had met earlier, found me a few minutes later, having apparently been assigned the task of checking on my well-being amid the chaos of preparation happening throughout the ship. "You should probably sit down, Commander," she said, gesturing toward a secured chair near the observation window. "This is going to get rough, and I would rather you not be thrown across the room when it does." I took her advice, settling into the chair as the ship's internal systems shifted around us, a subtle change in the ambient hum that suggested the Halcyon was reallocating power throughout its systems in preparation for combat. Through the viewport, I could see the Skarn formation clearly now, 12 warships arranged in a wide, encircling pattern, clearly intending to surround the human vessel and overwhelm it through sheer numerical advantage. "Is your captain truly going to fight all of them?" I asked Grace, unable to keep the disbelief from my voice. She glanced out the viewport herself, her expression calm despite the obvious severity of what we were facing. "He has fought worse odds before," she said, "though I will admit, this is a larger number than I typically like to see." The Skarn fleet opened fire almost the moment they came within range, a coordinated barrage designed to overwhelm the Halcyon's shields through sheer concentrated force rather than any particular tactical sophistication. I braced myself instinctively, expecting the same violent shuddering I had experienced aboard my own dying ship during the initial ambush, but the impact, when it came, registered only as a faint tremor running through the deck beneath my feet. "Shields holding at 94%, came a voice over the ship's internal comm system, calm and professional, despite the chaos unfolding outside. "Captain, we have a clear firing solution on the lead formation." "Take it," Captain Hale's voice replied, equally calm. "Focus on disabling engines and weapons systems where possible. Full destruction only if they refuse to disengage." I watched through the viewport as the Halcyon began to move, and I understood immediately that whatever restraint the ship had shown during its earlier engagement with the smaller Skarn patrol had been a deliberate choice rather than a limitation of its true capability. The vessel maneuvered with a speed and precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics I had spent my entire career studying, weaving between incoming fire with a grace that made the massive Skarn warships look clumsy and slow by comparison. Streams of energy weapons lanced out from the Halcyon's hull, each strike finding its mark with a precision that spoke of targeting systems far beyond anything the compact had ever developed. One Skarn vessel's weapons array erupted in a shower of sparks as a precisely placed strike disabled its primary cannons without breaching the hull itself. Another ship's engines flared and died under a similar targeted assault, leaving it drifting helplessly among its still active companions. "How is he doing this?" I asked Grace, watching in stunned silence as 3 more Skarn ships were systematically disabled within the span of only a few minutes. "Advanced targeting systems, combined with a lot of experience," she said simply. "This is not the first difficult fight this crew has faced together. We have learned over the years how to make the most of every advantage we have." The remaining Skarn ships, 7 of the original 12 now still fully operational, adjusted their formation in response to the losses they had already suffered, clearly attempting to coordinate a more focused assault rather than continuing their earlier scattered approach. I watched the tactical display Grace had activated on a nearby console, showing the shifting positions of both fleets in real time, and felt a fresh wave of fear as the remaining Skarn vessels began converging directly toward the Halcyon's position, their combined firepower now concentrated into a single, devastating strike. "Captain, they are massing for a concentrated assault," came another voice over the comm, this one carrying a note of genuine urgency for the first time since the battle began. If they land that strike simultaneously, it could overwhelm our shields regardless of our positioning. Understood, Captain Hale replied, his voice still calm but carrying a new sharpness that suggested he understood the seriousness of the moment as clearly as his crew did. Prepare evasive pattern 7. On my mark. I did not know what evasive pattern 7 entailed, but I watched with growing amazement as the Halcyons suddenly dropped in an unexpected trajectory, dipping below the plane of the incoming Skarn formation, just as their combined weapons fire converged on the space the ship had occupied only moments before. The concentrated strike tore through empty space where the Halcyon should have been, and the human vessel emerged from beneath the Skarn formation with its own weapons already charging for a devastating counterattack. Fire, Captain Hale ordered, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The Halcyon's weapon systems unleashed a coordinated barrage against the underside of the Skarn formation, striking multiple vessels simultaneously, in a display of precision that left me struggling to fully comprehend what I was witnessing. 3 more Skarn ships went dark within seconds, their systems disabled by strikes calculated with the same careful restraint I had observed during the earlier smaller engagement, damaging without destroying, disabling without killing. The remaining 4 Skarn vessels broke formation entirely, clearly recognizing that continuing the assault offered little chance of success against an enemy who had already demonstrated such overwhelming tactical superiority. I watched them begin to retreat, scattering in different directions as they attempted to escape the range of the Halcyon's weapons before further damage could be inflicted. "Do we pursue?" came a question over the comm, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting to hear how Captain Hale would answer. "No," he said, "let them go. Our priority was always protecting the Calresi crew, not destroying an enemy fleet. Confirm status on all our own systems, and prepare to hold position until we are certain the remaining threat has fully withdrawn." I sat in stunned silence as the Skarn ships disappeared from the tactical display, retreating back into the depths of the drift from which they had come, leaving behind only their disabled companions, drifting helplessly in the wreckage-filled space around us. The Halcyon itself showed remarkably little damage from an engagement that should have, by every calculation I understood from my own training, resulted in its complete destruction. Grace turned to me, offering a small, tired smile as the tension in the room finally began to ease. "See?" she said. "I told you he had fought worse odds before." I did not have words adequate to express what I had just witnessed. I had spent my entire life believing in a particular philosophy of survival, one built on caution, on careful calculation, on the idea that overwhelming force should always be avoided in favor of measured, sustainable strength. I had just watched a single ship, crewed by a species my own government had spent generations dismissing as reckless and unpredictable, systematically dismantle a numerically superior force, through a combination of precision, restraint, and what I could only describe as complete and unwavering confidence in its own capabilities. "Commander Vexthera," came Captain Hale's voice over the ship's comm system, addressing me directly for the first time since the battle had begun. "Your crew is safe, and the immediate threat has been neutralized. I imagine you have questions. I will be happy to answer what I can once we have moved to a safer distance from this system." I found my voice finally, though it came out quieter and more uncertain than I intended. "Thank you, Captain," I said. "I do not think I have adequate words for what you and your crew have done here today." "You do not need adequate words," he replied, and I could hear something almost gentle in his tone despite the exhaustion that must have been building after such an intense engagement. "You only need to be alive to see tomorrow. That is enough of a thank you for me." I sat back in my chair, watching through the viewport as the last traces of the battle faded into the quiet darkness of the Aldenar Drift, and felt, for the first time since the Skarn had first ambushed my battle group nearly a week earlier, something close to genuine safety. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, and I did not yet fully trust it, but for the first time in days, I allowed myself to believe that my crew and I might actually survive this ordeal after all. What I did not yet understand, sitting there in the aftermath of a battle I still could barely comprehend, was that surviving the Skarn had only been the first part of a much larger reckoning I was about to face, one that would challenge everything I believed about my own government, my own civilization, and the careful, cautious philosophy that had shaped every decision of my entire life. The days that followed our rescue passed in a strange, disorienting blur, filled with small moments that unsettled me more deeply than the battle itself had. I had expected, somewhere in the back of my mind, that a human warship would feel cold and mechanical, efficient in the way our own military vessels were efficient, every corridor and chamber built purely for function rather than comfort. What I found instead was something far more difficult to categorize. The corridors of the Halcyon were narrower than those aboard the Austran, but they were filled with small, unexpected details that spoke of a crew who had made this vessel into something resembling a home, rather than simply a tool of war. I passed rooms with soft lighting and personal belongings visible through open doorways, walls decorated with images that I later learned were photographs of families and places left behind on distant worlds. I heard laughter more than once, drifting from a communal dining area where off-duty crew members gathered between shifts, a sound I had not expected to find aboard a vessel that had just fought and won a battle against overwhelming odds. I remember walking past that dining area on my second day aboard the ship, still adjusting to the strange rhythms of human life, and pausing to watch a small group of crew members playing some kind of game involving cards and small tokens, their conversation loud and casual, in a way that would have been considered deeply inappropriate aboard any compact vessel I had ever served on. One of them, a young man with a wide, easy smile, noticed me standing at the entrance, and waved me over, without any apparent concern for the difference in our rank or species. "Commander, right? Come sit, we could use another player," he said, gesturing toward an empty seat at their table. I hesitated, uncertain how to respond to such an informal invitation from someone I did not know, whose name I had not even learned yet. "I am not familiar with your game," I said finally, which was true, though it was also, if I am honest, a way of avoiding the deeper discomfort I felt at the idea of participating in something so casual, so soon after everything my crew and I had endured. "That is fine. We will teach you," he said, undeterred by my hesitation. "I am Peter, by the way. Peter Doyle. I work in engineering, mostly keeping the power systems running smoothly, though apparently that mostly meant staying out of the captain's way during the fight yesterday." I found myself, somewhat against my own expectations, accepting the invitation and sitting down at their table. Over the following hour, as Peter and his companions patiently explained the rules of their card game, I learned more about the informal culture of the Halcyon's crew than I had learned about human society during my entire life growing up within the Compact's careful, distant observation of their species. They spoke openly about their families, about worlds I had never heard of, about disagreements with their captain that they discussed with a freedom that would have been unthinkable within the rigid hierarchy of Compact military service. They teased each other constantly, in a way that seemed affectionate rather than cruel, and I noticed, throughout the conversation, a genuine warmth between them that did not diminish despite the clear differences in their backgrounds and personalities. "You seem surprised by all this," said a woman across the table, whose name I learned was Nora Fields, one of the ship's navigation officers. "Did you expect us to be more serious, given everything that just happened?" "I suppose I did," I admitted. "In my experience, military discipline requires a certain distance between crew members, particularly across ranks. This feels very different." Nora considered this for a moment before answering. "I think we have found that people fight better for each other when they actually know each other," she said. "Discipline matters, do not misunderstand me. But so does trust, and trust is built in moments like this one, not just during battle." I thought about that observation for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind as I tried to reconcile it with everything I had been taught about proper military structure throughout my career. The Compact valued clear hierarchy, careful distance between ranks, the belief that emotional attachment between crew members could compromise the difficult decisions a commander sometimes needed to make. I had never questioned that philosophy before, not really, but sitting among this strange, warm, informal crew, I found myself wondering if perhaps my own civilization had sacrificed something valuable in its pursuit of careful, calculated efficiency. I met with Captain Hale privately on my third day aboard the Halcyon, in a small office adjacent to the ship's main command center. The room was simple, containing little beyond a desk, 2 chairs, and a few personal items that suggested a life lived largely in service to his ship and crew, rather than accumulated possessions. He offered me a seat and something warm to drink, a beverage he called simply coffee, which I found bitter but not entirely unpleasant. "I imagine you still have questions about why we came for you," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "I do," I admitted. "I understand your explanation, that you simply answered a distress call because no one else would, but I find myself struggling to understand the larger context. You risked an extraordinary amount for a crew belonging to a civilization that has never extended any particular friendship toward your people. I would like to understand why that risk felt justified to you." Captain Hale was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "I did not receive orders to rescue you, if that is part of what you are asking," he said finally. "I was operating independently in this region, gathering intelligence on Skarn movements for reasons that were entirely my own. When your distress call came through, there was no higher authority I needed to consult before deciding how to respond. That seems like an enormous amount of independent authority for a single captain to hold, I said. Perhaps by your civilization's standards, he replied. We operate somewhat differently. Captains in our fleet are trusted to make significant decisions independently, particularly in situations where waiting for official orders might cost lives that could otherwise be saved. It is not a perfect system. Mistakes happen, but I have found over many years of service that it produces better outcomes than a system built entirely around centralized caution. I thought about this for a long moment, comparing it against everything I understood about how Compact Fleet Command operated, the careful chains of authority, the extensive deliberation required before any significant military decision could be authorized. It was a system built to prevent costly mistakes, to ensure that no single officer's judgment, however skilled, could commit vast resources without appropriate oversight. It had always seemed to me like a wise and necessary structure. Can I ask you something else, Captain? I said, and he nodded for me to continue. During the battle against the smaller Skarn patrol, before the larger fleet arrived, you demonstrated a level of restraint I did not expect. You disabled their ships rather than destroying them outright. Why? He considered the question seriously before answering. Because destroying them entirely would not have served any purpose beyond the moment, he said. My priority was protecting your crew, not eliminating every threat I encountered along the way. There is a difference between necessary force and excessive force, and I try to remain conscious of that difference whenever I am able. My own people would likely disagree with that philosophy, I said. The Compact tends to view any engagement with the Skarn as an opportunity to weaken them as much as possible, given how dangerous their continued expansion has become. I understand that reasoning, Captain Hale said, but I've also found that unnecessary destruction tends to create enemies who remember, long after the immediate conflict has ended. Restraint, when it is possible, often serves longer-term interests better than total victory does. I sat with that thought for a while, sipping the bitter, warm drink he had offered me, trying to reconcile it with everything I had been taught about strength and survival throughout my entire career. The Compact's philosophy had always emphasized careful calculation, the idea that every resource, every risk, every potential loss needed to be weighed against clear strategic benefit. Captain Hale's philosophy seemed to operate on a different set of principles entirely, one that valued individual lives and long-term relationships over immediate tactical advantage. May I ask you something more difficult? I said finally, and he nodded again, his expression patient and unhurried. Do you know why my own government chose not to send help? I have wondered since this all began, whether their decision was truly as simple as the careful calculation they described in their final message to us, or whether something more troubling was happening that we were never told about. Something shifted subtly in Captain Hale's expression at that question, a flicker of something that looked almost like reluctance, though he did not look away from me. I do not know the full answer to that question, Commander, he said carefully. But I will tell you that during our approach into this system, my ship's sensors picked up something you should probably be aware of, something that I have been debating how best to share with you. My chest tightened with a sudden familiar dread. What did you find? I asked. There was another Compact vessel in this system, roughly 18 hours before we arrived, he said. A larger ship, based on the sensor signature, well within range to receive your distress calls and potentially offer assistance. It did not respond to your signals. It did not engage the Skarn forces threatening you. Instead, our logs show it changing course and departing the system entirely, moving in a direction that suggests it was returning toward Compact territory rather than attempting any kind of rescue. I felt something cold settle deep in my chest, a suspicion I had not allowed myself to fully consider until this moment. You are certain of this, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I am certain of what our sensors recorded, Captain Hale said gently. I cannot tell you why that ship made the choice it made, or what orders its commander might have been operating under, but I did not think it was right to keep that information from you, given everything your crew has already been through. I sat in silence for a long moment, processing the weight of what he had just told me, feeling the careful, comfortable philosophy I had believed in my entire life, beginning to crack apart in ways I was not yet prepared to fully confront. There had been another ship, another crew, capable of helping, close enough to answer our call, and they had chosen instead to leave us to die, without even the courtesy of acknowledging our distress signals. I did not know in that moment exactly what this discovery meant, or how deep the deception surrounding my abandonment truly ran, but I understood, with a growing and uncomfortable certainty, that the story I had been told about careful, unavoidable calculation was not the complete truth, and that I owed it to my crew, to Ashenvale and Halvorin and everyone else we had lost in the Aldenar drift, to find out exactly what that truth actually was. I did not sleep that night, or what passed for night, and the artificial rhythms maintained aboard the Halcyon. I lay in the small quarters I had been given, staring at the ceiling, turning over the information Captain Hale had shared with me, until it settled into something I could no longer ignore. A compact vessel had been close enough to help us. It had chosen not to. And if that was true, then everything I had been told about careful, unavoidable calculation, about the painful but necessary sacrifice of my battle group for the greater good of the compact, might have been built on a foundation far more troubling than simple caution. I found Doran early the following morning, in the small communal area near our assigned quarters, and I told him everything Captain Hale had shared with me. I watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief, to a slow, dawning anger that mirrored exactly what I had felt myself. "Another ship," he said quietly. "Close enough to help, and they simply left." "That is what the Halcyon sensor logs indicate," I confirmed. "Do you think Fleet Command knew?" he asked, though I could tell from his tone that he already suspected the answer. "I do not know," I admitted, "but I intend to find out." I approached Captain Hale later that same day, and asked him directly whether his crew possessed the technical capability to help me investigate further, to trace the identity and orders of that unidentified compact vessel, and to determine whether its departure had been an isolated failure, or something connected to a larger decision made at the highest levels of my own government. He considered my request carefully before agreeing, though he was honest about the limits of what his systems could accomplish. "We can identify the vessel's transponder signature from our sensor logs," he said. "Whether we can trace its orders or communications back to their source depends entirely on what kind of encryption your fleet uses, and whether we can find any additional data to cross-reference against it." Over the following 2 days, working alongside Grace and a quiet, methodical communications officer named Ethan Cole, I helped comb through every fragment of data the Halcyon had gathered during its approach into the Aldenar Drift. The work was slow and often frustrating, filled with false leads and incomplete signals, but eventually, we found something that changed the entire understanding of what had happened to my battle group. The unidentified vessel's transponder signature matched a compact cruiser called the Vantressa, assigned, according to older intelligence records Ethan managed to cross-reference, not to border patrol duties but to a diplomatic escort unit, operating directly under the authority of the Compact's Foreign Relations Council. This was not a routine patrol ship that had simply failed to notice our distress signals. This was a vessel with direct ties to the highest levels of Compact political leadership. Why would a diplomatic escort vessel be operating this close to an active combat zone? Doran asked, when I shared this discovery with him. I did not have an answer, not yet. But the question troubled me deeply enough that I found myself unable to let it rest. I requested access to whatever public Compact communications the Halcyon systems could intercept, hoping to find some clue that might explain the Vantressa's presence in a system it should have had no reason to be near. It took another full day of searching, but eventually, buried within a series of encrypted diplomatic transmissions that Ethan managed to partially decode, we found something that confirmed my worst suspicions. Roughly 1 week before the Skarn ambushed my battle group, Compact diplomatic representatives had entered into secret negotiations with senior Skarn leadership, discussing terms for a temporary ceasefire along a different, more strategically valuable section of the border. The partial transcript we recovered was incomplete, filled with gaps and technical jargon I struggled to fully interpret, but the general outline was clear enough to leave no doubt about its meaning. In exchange for the Skarn agreeing to halt their expansion along a heavily populated border region, closer to Compact core territory, Compact negotiators had quietly agreed to withdraw all defensive commitments from several outlying sectors, including the region surrounding the Aldenar Drift. My battle group's patrol mission, the one that had led us directly into the Skarn's hidden ambush, had been authorized and dispatched after those negotiations had already concluded, which meant that Fleet Command had sent us into a region they had already privately agreed to abandon. I remember sitting in stunned silence after reading through that partial transcript for the third time, trying to absorb the full weight of what it meant. It was not simply that my government had made a difficult, unavoidable calculation about acceptable losses after the Skarn ambush began. They had, in effect, already decided to sacrifice this entire region before we were ever sent into it, using my battle group's patrol mission as a means of gathering intelligence on Skarn movements in a sector they had no intention of actually defending. They knew, I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else in the room. They knew before we were even sent here. Doran, sitting beside me, looked as horrified as I felt. Ashenvale, Halvoran, everyone we lost, he said slowly. They died gathering intelligence for a negotiation that had already been settled. I brought everything we had discovered to Captain Hale that evening, sitting once again in his small, quiet office. watching his expression as I explained the full scope of what our investigation had uncovered. He listened without interrupting, his features carefully controlled, though I could see something hardening behind his calm exterior as I spoke. "I am sorry, Commander," he said finally, once I had finished. "I wish I could tell you this was an isolated failure, a single mistake made by a government otherwise committed to protecting its people. But I have encountered similar patterns before, in other civilizations that valued careful political calculation above the lives of the people they claimed to serve." "How do you live with that knowledge?" I asked him, my voice unsteady in a way I did not try to hide. "How do you continue serving a system that operates that way?" "I do not serve a system built on that philosophy," he said simply. "That is precisely why I made the choice I made when your distress call came through. I have seen what happens when leaders convince themselves that some lives matter less than others, that certain losses are simply the acceptable price of a larger strategy. It rarely stops with a single sacrifice. It becomes easier each time, until an entire philosophy of governance is built around deciding whose lives are worth saving and whose are not." I thought of Korvath's old briefing, of her calm insistence that the Compact's careful calculations had kept our civilization alive for centuries. I wondered, now, how many other battle groups, how many other crews, had been quietly sacrificed in service of negotiations and political maneuvering they never knew existed, all while being told a comforting story about unavoidable strategic necessity. "What do I do with this information?" I asked Captain Hale, though I suspected I already knew what my own conscience was demanding of me. "That is not a decision I can make for you," he said gently, "but I will tell you this. In my experience, the truth rarely stays hidden forever, especially when there are people brave enough to insist on bringing it into the light, regardless of the personal cost. Whatever you decide, know that my crew and I stand ready to help you present this evidence, if that is the path you choose to take." I sat with that offer for a long moment, feeling the full weight of the decision now resting on my shoulders. I could remain silent, accept the comfortable narrative my government had constructed, and return home to whatever quiet, unremarkable career awaited a commander who had survived against impossible odds. Or I could bring this evidence forward, challenge the careful, cautious philosophy that had shaped my entire life, and risk whatever consequences might follow from exposing a truth that powerful people within my own government clearly wanted to remain buried. I thought of Ashenvale's children, growing up believing their mother had died, in an unavoidable tragedy, rather than as the direct result of a political calculation made weeks before her ship was ever destroyed. I thought of Hal Voren, and of every other crew member we had lost in the Aldenar Drift. All of them owed, at the very least, the truth about exactly what their sacrifice had actually served. "I want to bring this forward," I said finally, my voice steadier now than it had been throughout the entire conversation. "My crew deserves to know the truth. The families of everyone we lost deserve to know the truth. And if there is even a small chance that exposing this might prevent it from happening again to some other battle group in some other forgotten corner of space, then I believe it is worth whatever risk that choice carries." Captain Hale nodded slowly, something that looked almost like respect settling into his expression. "Then we will help you carry that truth home, Commander," he said, "whatever it takes." I left his office that evening carrying a weight I had not expected to bear when I first sent that final, desperate distress call into the void nearly 2 weeks earlier. I had survived the scarn. I had survived the abandonment of my own government. And now, standing at the threshold of returning home, I understood that the hardest part of this entire ordeal might still lie ahead of me, in the quiet, careful halls of compact power, where uncomfortable truths were rarely welcomed, regardless of how many lives they had ultimately cost. The Halcyon carried my crew and myself back toward compact territory over the following 6 days, a journey that felt, in many ways, longer and more difficult than the desperate week we had just survived in the Aldenar Drift. I spent much of that time preparing everything we would need to present our evidence properly, working alongside Ethan and Grace to organize the intercepted communications, the sensor logs, and the timeline of events into a clear and undeniable account of exactly what had happened to my battle group. Doran helped me draft a formal report, one that would eventually be submitted not only to Fleet Command but to the broader Compact Oversight Council responsible for reviewing military conduct during active conflicts. We worked carefully, checking and rechecking every detail, understanding that whatever we presented would need to withstand the scrutiny of officials who would have every reason to dismiss or discredit our findings if given the opportunity. I spoke with Captain Hale often during those final days aboard his ship, our conversations ranging from the practical details of our approaching arrival to broader discussions about the differences between our two civilizations. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely enjoying his company, appreciating the quiet, thoughtful way he approached even difficult questions, and the evident care he showed toward every member of his crew, human and Calresi alike. "What will happen to you once you deliver this report?" he asked me during one of our final conversations, sitting in the same small office where he had first told me about the Vantressa's unexplained departure from the Aldenar Drift. "I do not know," I admitted honestly. "It is possible this will be quietly buried, and I will simply be reassigned to some distant post where I can cause no further inconvenience. It is possible there will be a genuine investigation, though I suspect the officials responsible for that ceasefire negotiation will fight hard to protect themselves from any real consequences." "And if it is buried," he asked, "will it have been worth the risk?" I considered the question seriously before answering. "Yes," I said finally. "Regardless of what happens to me personally, my crew deserves to know the truth about what we survived. The families of everyone we lost deserve that same truth. Whatever consequences I face for bringing it forward, I do not believe I could have lived with myself if I had simply stayed silent." Captain Hale nodded, and I saw something in his expression that looked almost like pride, though I understood we had known each other far too briefly for that word to feel entirely accurate. "For what it is worth," he said, "I think you are exactly the kind of officer your compact needs more of, whether they realize it or not." We arrived at the edge of compact territory on the 6th day, close enough that my crew and I could be transferred to a compact vessel for the remainder of our journey home. I stood at the airlock with Captain Hale as the transfer preparations were finalized, feeling a strange, unexpected sadness at the thought of leaving behind a crew that had shown my own people such extraordinary kindness during our darkest hour. "Thank you," I said again, understanding even as I spoke the words that they remained inadequate to the true scope of what he and his crew had done for us. "For everything. I do not know how I will ever properly repay what you have given us." "You do not owe me anything, Commander," he said, extending his hand once more in that same simple gesture I had learned to recognize as distinctly human. "Just remember what you learned out here, and try to carry it forward into whatever comes next. That will be repayment enough." I gripped his hand firmly, meeting his eyes with a gratitude I did not think I would ever be able to fully express. "I will not forget," I told him, and I meant it completely. The journey home aboard the compact vessel that finally retrieved us felt strangely quiet after the warmth and informality of the Halcyon, a reminder of exactly how different our two civilizations truly were. I spent much of that final leg of the journey preparing myself mentally for the difficult conversations that awaited me, rehearsing how I would present our findings, anticipating the objections and denials I expected from officials eager to protect themselves from accountability. The reception I received upon returning to Calris Prime was, as I had feared, complicated and uncomfortable. Senior Fleet Command officials questioned me extensively about the events in the Aldenar Drift, their tone carefully professional but unmistakably guarded whenever I raised the subject of the Vantressa's unexplained departure, or the secret ceasefire negotiations that had apparently doomed my battle group before we were ever deployed. Some officials seemed genuinely troubled by what I presented. Others seemed far more concerned with managing the political fallout than with addressing the underlying truth of what had happened. I will not claim that my report produced the sweeping, immediate change I had once hoped for during those long nights aboard the Halcyon. The officials directly responsible for the ceasefire negotiation offered careful, measured explanations that avoided any direct admission of wrongdoing, and the formal investigation that eventually followed moved with the same slow, cautious deliberation that characterized nearly everything the compact undertook. But the truth, once spoken aloud and documented clearly, could not be entirely buried either. Ashenvale's family learned the full circumstances of her death. Halvoran's record was updated to reflect the reality of what he had actually died defending. And within certain quiet circles of Fleet Command, I understood that my report had at least begun to raise uncomfortable questions about the true cost of the Compact's careful, calculated philosophy of survival. I think about Captain Hale often, even now, years after that desperate week in the Aldenar Drift. I think about the strange, warm culture aboard his ship, so different from the careful hierarchy I had spent my entire career serving within. I think about his simple, unwavering conviction that answering a distress call required no elaborate justification beyond the fact that people needed help, and I find myself, even now, still working to fully understand the wisdom contained within that deceptively simple philosophy. My people have spent generations quietly dismissing humans as reckless, emotional, and dangerously unpredictable, a species too different from our own careful, measured approach to survival to ever be fully trusted or understood. I no longer believe that assessment holds the weight it once did. I have seen, with my own eyes, what that supposedly reckless species is capable of when someone in danger calls out for help, And I have seen, with equal clarity, the true cost of my own civilization's careful, calculated caution when it is applied without genuine compassion behind it. I do not know what the future holds for the relationship between our two civilizations. The compact remains cautious by nature, slow to extend trust or friendship to species it does not fully understand, and I suspect that will remain true for a long time to come. But I carry with me now a different understanding than the one I grew up with, one built not on old rumors and careful dismissals, but on the memory of a single ship emerging from the void when every calculation said it should not have come at all. Rescue was never meant to come for my crew. Every careful, measured philosophy my civilization had ever taught me said as much, and Fleet Command had made their decision clear long before the Skarn ever launched their final assault. We were an acceptable loss, a small sacrifice in service of some larger, more important calculation, happening far away from the wreckage and desperation we lived through in that dying corner of space. And yet it came anyway, out of the silence and the dark, asking for nothing in return beyond the simple, uncomplicated desire to save people who needed saving. I think, in the end, that is the truest lesson I carried home from the Aldenar Drift, more valuable than any report or investigation, or careful political reckoning that followed. Some things matter beyond calculation. Some choices are worth making regardless of their cost. And somewhere out among the stars, there remain those rare few who understand that truth completely, and who are willing, when the moment demands it, to cross the entire void to prove it.